Preterm birth is more than one thing, and that's part of the difficulty in identifying factors that cause it. So we say that preterm birth occurs when labour and birth occur before 37 weeks completed gestation, but it can be spontaneous or it can be induced by a doctor. And there are two types of spontaneous preterm birth. There's preterm pre-labour rupture of membranes. So a woman's uterus doesn't start contracting, her membranes rupture, and then labour will follow that. Or she can go into labour where her uterus is contracting, and then the baby will be delivered. And there are different proportions of preterm birth that have these characteristics. Preterm birth may be preceded by placenta previa or placental abruption, but also this doctor-induced or iatrogenic preterm labour occurs often when the doctor is trying to treat something occurring in the mother, for example, severe preeclampsia, or if the baby is shown to be suffering severe growth restriction. And so in the case of severe preeclampsia, the doctor may induce an early labour in order to save the mother her life and or her baby's life. But there's a big trade-off between saving the woman but also looking after a very young neonate in terms of gestation. So Michael has mentioned or given you some information about the health impact of preterm birth. So there are health impacts for both the mother and the child. So in terms of the mother, the risks of delivering preterm may be that this preterm delivery may be associated with infection. She may even develop septicemia, or she may have had a placental abruption, which is an abrupt separation of the placenta, which could cause her to bleed to death. But also, women who deliver their babies preterm themselves have lifelong health risks, and this may reflect genetic factors that predispose them both to delivering preterm, but also to other diseases that they may die earlier of, like cardiovascular disease, compared to women who deliver their babies at term. And Michael, of course, mentioned the consequences for the baby, which I don't need to go into them, but there are, of course, perinatal risks, but also lifelong health risks. So just to put it into perspective, we've heard a few different numbers tonight, and I've drawn this graph, and it's adapted from the 2010 National Perinatal Statistics. And you can see that about 70% of pregnancies in Australia are uncomplicated. And preterm birth, at least in the 2010 statistics, occurred in about 7.5% of pregnancies. Hypertension, which could either be preeclampsia or gestational hypertension, occurred in about 7%. Low birth weight in over 6%, and of course some of these babies are also in this group. Gestational diabetes occurs in about 5% of pregnancies, and then there are some other complications. And just looking at the actual distribution of delivery, you can see here on the x-axis down here is gestational age in weeks, and you can see a small percentage of babies are born at this very early stage, but the vast majority of babies are born between 37 and 41 weeks gestation, so at term. Indeed, it's nearly 92% of babies, with another nearly 1% of babies born post-term. And just putting that together in something a little more digestible. So these babies are those who are considered to be extremely preterm, these are very preterm, and these are what we call the late preterm babies. But again, you can see that nearly 92% of babies are born at term, but it's not necessarily all beer and skittles for those women and babies, because some of them, as I've shown you, will have preeclampsia or maybe growth restriction or another complication. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm a placental researcher, and there is a lot of evidence to suggest that events in the early differentiation of the placenta may precede the range of pregnancy complications, including preterm births. So here you can see This is an 8-week human conceptus and then a 10-week conceptus, and you can see that most of the growth in early gestation is actually in the placenta, and the fetus is very tiny, but of course it's a very important time in development where organogenesis is occurring, so all its organs are being formed. So we've been looking at a variety of risk factors that associate with all adverse pregnancy outcomes, and I've listed them here. Now those in purple are things clearly that you can't do anything about. So when a woman has a pregnancy complication or when she delivers her baby preterm, it's not her fault. I think a lot of women, when something goes wrong in pregnancy, think they did something wrong. And I think for many women that is not the case at all, and it's very hard to understand what went wrong. But of course we're trying to identify what did go wrong. But there are some factors that we can do something about that we know do contribute to pregnancy complications and indeed contribute to risk for preterm delivery. So I'll just talk about a few today, not all of these, but these are some that we've been working on. So genetics, as Sarah mentioned, is something we have a strong interest in. So there are definitely some gene variants that predispose women to delivering their babies preterm, or predispose a baby to being delivered preterm. So of course the baby has its own unique genome, which is a combination of that of the mother and the father. And so sometimes it's the crosstalk between the mother and the fetus that may induce a preterm delivery, and not the mother's fault or the fetus's fault. Other factors are also associated with risk for preterm birth, and I'll go into a few of these now. So first of all, genetics. So we know that preterm birth does run in families. So if you have a family history of preterm birth, you may be more at risk of delivering your baby preterm, and that suggests some genetic component. But also preterm delivery is more common in some ethnic groups. For example, in the US, the preterm delivery rate is about 12%, but in Black American women, it's at nearly 17%. And this has been shown to be independent of socioeconomic factors. We do know that poor socioeconomic status does predispose a woman to a variety of complications. Also, there have been a variety of genome-wide studies, so that is looking at all the genes in our genome to identify whether there are some variants that associate with preterm delivery. And quite a number have been identified, and these include genes that are involved in inflammation, in control of blood pressure, in angiogenesis, which is the generation of new blood vessels, which can be important in the placenta in terms of transferring sufficient nutrient to the growing conceptus. Also, genes involved in thrombosis have been associated with preterm delivery. So thrombosis is when blood clots, and you can have very small clots we call microclots or microthromboses within the placenta that can perturb its function. But also genes involved in tissue remodeling, because during development, the fetus itself is undergoing rapid tissue remodeling in order to differentiate its organs, but also the uterus has and the placenta both have huge amounts of tissue remodeling as they basically invent themselves and change themselves across gestation. Also a number of different growth factors and their receptors. So these are factors or genes that control the growth of various tissues or bones. These have been also associated with preterm birth, but none of these genes on their own or even in combination can really explain the whole breadth of preterm birth. Another factor that's been associated with preterm birth, and certainly placental dysfunction, is fetal sex. So we know from a number of studies that the placenta associated with a male fetus functions differently than that of the female. And this graph here is hot off the press. We've just written a manuscript for submission for publication on data from over 554,000 pregnancies in South Australia over about a 30-year period. And what the graph shows, if we look at gestational age categories along the x-axis, so again these very extremely preterm and very preterm infants, this line here, dotted line at 1, is if you have an equal number of males and females, and anything above the line means that there's increased prevalence in males rather than female fetuses. And you can see that these very early preterm infants are more likely to be male. So that ratio is 1.3 to 1 instead of 1 to 1. And it's not really until you get to term that that ratio returns to 1. So preterm birth is more likely to occur when the fetus is a male. So you definitely can't blame yourself if that's the case. Now, we've also been looking at a number of different micronutrients in pregnancy, and vitamin D is, it's not really a vitamin, it's actually a hormone, but it's been the subject of intense interest, not only in reproductive health, but in the wide range of health, because when it's deficient, it's not only associated with rickets and poor bone health, as it's well known for, but it's also associated with high blood pressure, it's associated with diabetes, it's associated with obesity, and a whole lot of other diseases. Oh, I'm sorry. But in terms of pregnancy, vitamin D deficiency has been associated with preeclampsia, so that condition when the mother's blood pressure is high, with small for gestational age babies, so those babies who didn't grow well, with gestational diabetes, and importantly, with preterm birth. But also a combination of genetic variants, which we call SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, in combination with deficiency in the mother of vitamin D, have been associated with small babies and with gestational diabetes. And these genes are just in the vitamin D pathway. So this is the vitamin D receptor gene, and this is a gene that activates vitamin D from its inactive state to its active and functional state. So together there are genetic factors that can interact with the amount of vitamin D in the mother's circulation that can predict pregnancy outcome. So what about in Adelaide? We've been measuring vitamin D, or the circulating form of vitamin D, 25-hydroxyvitamin D, which is the inactive form, but it's the marker of vitamin D status, that if you go to your doctor, that's what will be measured. So we've measured it in a cohort of 1,169 Adelaide women, and despite the fact that Adelaide is renowned for its sunshine and vitamin D is made in our skin from the action of UV light, despite that, we have a significant number of women who are deficient or insufficient in vitamin D. The IMVS uses the cutoff of 60 nanomoles per litre as the level of sufficiency for vitamin D. And in this cohort of women, we have 35% of women have less than that threshold for sufficiency of vitamin D. These measurements were taken at 15 weeks of gestation, so in the first half of pregnancy. But there are a number of groups, including the Endocrine Society of Australia, that think that the level of sufficiency should be set at 80 nanomoles per litre, and you can see that 3/4 of the women in this cohort in Adelaide have insufficient vitamin D in the circulation. And we know that vitamin D is necessary for pregnancy. In fact, the active form of